Professor Lichtman, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining us today.
My great pleasure. And let me add, I'm also doing a live show every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern at Allan Lichtman YouTube. And you can follow all my thinking there.
Excellent. Oh, that's wonderful. So I've been very excited to have this conversation with you because you
Certainly.
are not so much for your predictions. I know that you're still in the course of reading the tea leaves, but I really want my audience to be familiar with the science of the way that you do
Yes.
this work. So you've been very successful in the past at accurately predicting the outcomes of presidential elections. And I want, if you could, to just give us a sense as to your methodology. What are the examples and the keys that you look to help you make your determinations historically, and how excited are you about what's happening right now?
It's a great question, Laurie. And I'd love to tell you I came up with the keys to the White House, which are an alternative to the polls and the pundits, by ruining my eyes in the archives and deep contemplation. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I actually came across the keys largely by accident. Let me say, they are fundamentally different from the pundits and the pollsters in that what they gauge is how American presidential elections really work as
Mm.
votes up or down on the strength and performance of the White House party, with all the twists and turns of the campaigns that the pundits talk about and the pollsters track. In the end, have little or nothing to do with the outcome of an election. So, how did
Mm.
I come up with this? In 1981, long before you were born, I was a distinguished.
Oh, you're so kind, but I would have to correct you on that, friend.
Don't have to.
That was, I'm gonna relish in that for a little while now. Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was a distinguished visiting scholar at Caltech in Southern California. And there I met the world's leading authority on earthquake prediction, Volodya Kailis Borak, the head of the Institute of Earthquake Prediction and Pattern Recognition in
Mm.
Moscow. And he said, his idea, let's collaborate. And of course, being brilliant and foresightful, I said, absolutely not. Earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. I have to go back to Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. Nobody cares about earthquakes there.
Mm.
And he said, no, no, I already solved earthquakes. Right. But he said, get this. In 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that
Huh.
came to DC under JFK and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, that
Oh.
kept us from poisoning our oceans, our soil, and our atmosphere. And he said in Washington, he fell in love with politics and always wanted to use the methodology of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said,
Huh.
look, I live in the Soviet Union. Elections? Forget it. It's supreme
Right.
leader or off with your head. But he said to me, you're an expert in American history, politics, and the presidency. So I
Mm.
gave in, and we became the odd couple of
Mm.
American political research, the Soviet geophysicist and the US historian. And now this is critical to develop a whole new way of approaching a problem. The first thing you do is reconceptualize it.
Hmm.
And we reconceptualized American presidential elections in geophysical terms.
Huh.
Remember, this is 1981. So we looked at elections not as Carter versus Reagan, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, but as stability. The White House party keeps power, and earthquake. The White House party is tossed out of power.
Mm.
With that in mind, we looked at every American presidential election from the horse and buggy days of politics, election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 through the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Remember, this is 1981. And we were guided by my theory about American presidential elections, that indeed they were all about whether or not the electorate made a decision that the White House party had governed enough to get 4 more years.
Mm.
And we used Volodya's method of pattern recognition over that 120 years of politics. to figure out what patterns were associated with stability and earthquake.
Wow.
And that led to the 13 keys, 13 key questions, true false questions, which probed the strength and performance of the White House party, and a
Mm.
simple decision rule. You don't even have to take your shoes off to use the keys. If 6 or more go against the White House party, any 6, they're equally weighted, it's
Wow.
nonlinear, they are predicted losers. Otherwise, they are predicted winners. Now, remember, this is all retrospective. I first used the keys predictively in April 1982 when I
Mm.
predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection in the midst of what was then the worst recession since the Great Depression, when his approval ratings were in the gutter, and when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run. This was
Huh.
almost 3 years before. And of course, my most controversial prediction, which you know, was against all the conventional wisdom, all the modelers virtually, all the odds to predict Donald Trump's win in 2016, which you can imagine did not make me very popular in 90% plus Democratic Washington, D.C., where I
Wow.
teach at American University. But I would say my track record, I'm not bragging, is unsurpassed. No other model, pundit, pollster has predicted 10 elections over a 40-year span. Maybe I've just outlived everyone. Who knows?
Well, as the kids would say, you have receipts. So the pollsters can poll, but you've got actual receipts. And for people who are perhaps not quite clear, how does a public poll rate in terms of effectiveness at predicting anything
Yes.
as compared to these keys? Because we're seeing a lot of information about the polls. I am old enough to remember when Hillary Clinton was winning based on the polls, and then we all saw what happened. So we say on this show lovingly that polls are for strippers and not necessarily for actual predictions politically. What say you about the value of polls when it comes to letting us know who may ultimately win the White House?
I have said, and the pollsters are buddies of mine. I have nothing against them, but
Yeah.
I've said during an election cycle, we should take all the horse race pollsters, and send them on vacation. Very nice island in the far out Pacific Ocean.
Mm,
Polls are snapshots,
yeah.
but unfortunately, they are abused
Mm,
as predictors.
yeah.
It's so easy. You don't even have to get out of bed in the morning to write a story about the polls, and they create
Right.
this illusion of a horse race,
Mm,
candidates sprinting ahead or falling behind on the twists and turns of the campaign. The other problem with polls that no one tells you is you've seen the error margins, right? Plus and minus 3%. But
right.
that's pure statistical error. That's
Mm,
the error you would get if you had a huge jar of green and red balls and you took a sample to estimate the percentage of green and red balls in the jar. But human beings are not green and red balls.
that's
They
right.
may lie to pollsters. Most people don't respond to pollsters.
That's
They
right.
may change their mind. They may not have focused on the election. Plus, no one has voted yet. So
Mm,
the pollsters have to guess who the so-called likely voters are. This introduces a
wow.
whole level of error above and beyond plus and minus 3, and it's not random, it's unidirectional. We all know the mistake the pollsters made in 2016, underestimating Republican voter strength.
That's
Well,
right.
like generals fighting the last war, they tried to adjust for that, and now they're underestimating Democratic voting strength based on elections in the midterms, the off year of 2023, and the
Right.
specials of 2024. Democrats are outperforming the polls by at least 5%. My best example, the most famous special election, of course, was for the congressional seat of the disgraced George Santos,
That's
right on
right.
the of the election, right? The pollster said it was a dead heat. Democrat ahead by an insignificant 1 point. He won by 8 points,
Mm.
outperforming the polls by 7 points.
Wow. So thank you for that context. I know sometimes people think I'm being a little crotchety when I criticize our reliance on polls for information, but I like how it's a snapshot. And I think if we could send them out to that island with no Wi Fi, that would be even better. But if you could
I'm
talk
way more crotchety than you, so don't worry.
talk to us about these keys, these 13 indicators that you use as your tea leaves, and how we, the public, would be able to sort of mentally keep track. Like, oh, Professor Lichtman said this key means this. According to the news, maybe that is an indication of this, that, or the other. Now, folks, we're not going to become predictors. We're not going to, I don't want anyone calling up at 866-801-8255 becoming predictors. We just want to know the science, and hopefully we'll get Professor Lichtman back when he is ready to indicate what some of his predictions are closer towards the election. But Professor Lichtman, walk us through these 13 keys.
Yes. The 13 keys are the world's only do-it-yourself prediction system. As I'm saying, I don't want people out there to become predictors, but unlike the fancy, political science models or the polls, the keys are intuitive.
Mm,
Based on history, they give you substantive factors, which are a great teaching tool.
yeah.
They're being used all over the country in high school and colleges because to answer the questions at each key, you've got to go through all of American history since
Wow.
1860. But if you want to use my keys, and people do it all the time, but don't call in with your predictions to Lurie or to me,
Lurie.
you've got to stick to the system. You can't
Okay.
freelance. You got to read my book, predicting the next president. So here are the keys.
Okay.
Mandate based on U.S. House elections, incumbency, internal party contest for the White House party,
Uh-oh.
third party, short term economy, long term economy, policy change, social unrest, scandal, foreign/military failure,
Mm,
foreign/military success. That's
uh-oh.
11 of the 13. And you note none of them has anything to do with the campaign or the candidates, the major
Yeah.
party candidates, but they are gauging the strength and performance of the White House party. And the
Wow.
way the keys are phrased is an answer of true always favors stability, an answer of false favors earthquake. The last two keys are the only keys pertaining to the candidates, but they're
Mm.
very high threshold keys. They ask whether the incumbent party candidate is one of those once in a generation inspirational candidates who
Mm.
converts large numbers of the opposition. The
Okay.
iconic examples are Franklin Roosevelt, who at the end of a solidly Republican era created the new Roosevelt dominant Democratic coalition,
Mm.
and Ronald Reagan, who had lots of Reagan
Huh.
Democrats. So the keys ask, is the incumbent party candidate a candidate who fills those conditions? And is the challenging party candidate one who does not? Because the answer of true always favors the reelection of the White House party.
Okay, so there are some of these keys that, and I actually can see how this would be really useful in a government classroom or in a history classroom, social studies, because these really would require you to have a much more in depth understanding of American history if you wanted to apply this historically. But when we're talking about some of these party mandate, in the incumbent, you said on the website for you at American University, it says after the midterm elections, the incumbent party holds more seats in the House of Representatives than after the previous midterm elections. That would we the Democrats now hold fewer seats
Correct.
in the House, so
We're
that
going to
would
get
not
that
be a
too.
key in their favor. Is that am I doing this correctly, Professor?
You're doing this correctly. Again, we're not going to do a prediction.
That's right.
Correctly interpreted that key. And let me say, you know, I have been blasted for 40 years as
Oh,
so-called committing the sin of subjectivity. Some of my keys are not just cut and dry. And
right.
my answer has been the same for 40 years. Uh, it's not subjectivity, it's judgment. We're dealing with human beings, not green and red balls. And
Mm.
historians make judgments all the time, but these are not random judgments. When you read my book, you'll see the judgments are constrained in two ways. Number one, as we explained in the charisma key, the inspirational key, the definitions are very carefully spelled out. And two, I've answered these questions since
Mm.
1860. So the
Right.
next time you answer the question, it's got to be consistent. It took about 15 years, but
Huh.
finally the forecasting community realized these big, fancy, economic models that are supposedly objective don't work. They
Mm.
fail all the
Yeah.
time. And that the most successful models, like the keys, have some cut and dried indicators like statistics on midterm elections with some judgment indicators. I
Mm.
twice keynoted the International Forecasting Summit after being blasted for so many years. So save your bell bottoms. You never know what might come back.
It's got to give you a little bit of, I don't know, pleasure, joy to get to have so many haters, as the kids would say, and to yet consistently be proven correct. I think there's only one prediction that was not accurate, or was there ever one that you were not accurate on?
Look, first of all, I welcome critics,
Mm.
not haters. I mean, nobody likes to be hated, but I welcome substantive, accurate
Mm.
critiques. Unfortunately, 99% of the attacks on me are not accurate, are
Mm.
based on a misunderstanding of history, a misunderstanding of my predictions. They haven't read my book, they haven't followed my live show. But I
Yeah.
don't I don't want to complain. That's fine. Much better to be criticized than to be ignored. The worst thing is to be ignored. Now, my most controversial call, in the sense of whether I was right or wrong, was for Gore in 2000. I contend I was right. In
I'm with you on this one.
2020,
Go ahead, give us your response. But I'm going to preempt. I'm going to tease the water by just saying I'm with you on this one. Go ahead though, because
yeah,
I'm still
it
upset
was a
about that
stolen
election.
election, as I proved,
Yes,
because of the suppression of the black vote.
that's
As
right.
I proved in my report to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. It's still on their website. You can look it up. And 2001, 3 years later, an independent study from someone I don't know, Professor Walter Mebane of Cornell University, confirmed my findings.
Mm,
His article was called "The Wrong Man is Elected President," and he found, based on the intent of the voters, Gore should have won Florida by tens of thousands of votes and
wow.
lost the presidency. So I contend I was right about 2000, but it's like the Kennedy assassination, although I'm not comparing it to that significance, but it's one of those things about which people will argue about forever. What
Yeah. So
happened in 2000?
yeah, but like I said, I still remember the frustration and the anger, and that was the first time I realized I was coming of age in that election. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, this is not just as simple as we vote. Like that's when I realized the complexities of this system in a variety of ways. I want to ask you about one of these keys in particular, because of there's so many questions swirling around America's position on the foreign stage right now, vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza. We're seeing a lot of protests and a lot of shifting discourse, even in the nature of those protests. But you have as key number 10, foreign and military failure, where the incumbent administration suffers no major failure in foreign and military affairs. And then number 11, foreign and military success, where the incumbent administration achieves a major success in military or foreign affairs. What does the current reality internationally and the current what we know about the current sentiments about America's position, both here among young voters in particular, does that give you any insight into how you think those keys may ultimately fare, just based on what we know now?
Those are by far the most difficult keys to call. And I
Mm,
have not made calls on them because, the shifting fortunes of war,
right.
different groups within the United States, more sympathetic to the Palestinians or the Israelis.
Yeah,
But we've had a major development. My whole live show yesterday was on it. Remember, Tuesdays, Thursdays,
that's
9
right.
p.m. Eastern at Allan Lichtman YouTube. The incursion of the Ukrainians stunningly into Russia and
Right.
capturing apparently hundreds of thousands of square miles. Critical to the keys is you don't make snap judgments. You got to
Mm,
wait and see.
yeah.
But that could turn things around in Ukraine and turn it into a foreign policy success.
Wow.
I'm not saying it will, but I'm watching that.
Yeah.
What I'm watching in Gaza, which looks like a foreign policy failure, is can the Biden administration, against the opposition, and don't get me started on
Mm,
Netanyahu, broker a ceasefire and a hostage release in Gaza. that could change fundamentally the situation there. So
Okay.
these are the things I am very closely following with respect to these two wars. But again, I warn all analysts, don't make snap judgments.
Mm, okay. And I know we have a lot of couch armchair predictors out there. I'm sure they're going to be furiously. We're going to tweet out the link to your page and of course, the link to your book. Folks, he is Professor Allan Lichtman. You've heard him on Clay Cane's show, on Karen Hunter's show. He is, again, a distinguished professor of history at American University, a historian, and the author of 12 books, including the one that's at the subject of our conversation today, Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House 2024. Professor Lichtman, if you could just give us your website one more time, because I know as soon as we hang up this call, we're going to get messages of people asking how to contact you. So if you could just one more time give us your information.
That Allan Lichtman is the way to contact me. But if you want to directly talk to me, you can on my live show at Allan Lichtman YouTube, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern. I spend most of my hour taking questions from my audience. I do with my son, who's a communications expert. We just started with 0, and we now have almost 90,000 subscribers.
Wow, that is fantastic. There is a real hunger for information and a real hunger for accuracy and understanding how politics and government work. When I'm not on these airwaves, I run a law center based at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, and I cannot tell you how much better our voter education team feels, our voter empowerment team, now that we are in an era where people actually want to know how these things work and what, all of the when I was a kid, we had, Pete, the I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. We had the songs, we had,
Yep.
civic education in a different way. So I'm grateful for folks like you and your son for
Thank you
doing the
so
work of
much.
making sure we're properly informed. Thank
I'll
you for
talk
being
to
with
you
us.
again after my prediction. Take
Yes,
care.
I'm looking forward to it. Be well, Professor Lichtman. Looking
You
forward to
too.
it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.